coming. I'm glad you're here. I was just taking a pass around the studios, and I got to say, I'm glad to see each of your faces here tonight. Welcome back. This is the College of Architecture and Design Lecture Series. Tonight's lecture is supported by the Robert B. Church Memorial Lecture Fund. I want to say thanks to the committee, as always, that's Jennifer Ackerman, Gail Fulton, and Diane Fox, and myself. And also to just the various staff who facilitate all this stuff. So a lot of work goes into it. There's a lot of people who have a lot of responsibilities all over the page. Tonight I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Lyndon Neri. Lyndon's the co-founder with Rossana Hu of Neri & Hu Design and Research Office, an interdisciplinary architectural design practice based in Shanghai, China. So Lyndon flew all the way from Shanghai to see us today. It's about 5 a.m. I think for you. Yeah. They also have an additional office in London. I'll quote them in saying that Neri & Hu's location is purposeful, with Shanghai and in my estimation China at large considered a new global frontier. Neri & Hu is at the center of the contemporary chaos. I think it's a true honor to have Lyndon here this evening from such an amazing, recognized, and awarded design practice. They have a truly international profile with projects and publications and awards from around the world. A quick glance at their website, the map feature on their website shows a global reach. While the list of awards, I'm afraid, is too long to unroll fully here, I'll mention a few. And that Neri & Hu have been named Designers of the Year by Wallpaper magazine in the UK, Asia Designers of the Year by Maison & Objet in France, and they've been inducted into the Interior Design Hall of Fame in the US. And perhaps my favorite on the list, on the very long list, is in 2018, Lyndon was named the Architect of the Year in GQ China's Men of the Year edition. I like that one. Their international project is reflected in the composition of their office. And I'll quote again by saying, Neri & Hu is composed of multicultural staff who speak over 30 languages. The diversity of the team reinforces a core vision for the practice to respond to a global worldview, incorporating overlapping design disciplines for a new paradigm in architecture. They accomplish all this through what I think is an astonishing attention to detail, to craft, material, and light qualities and experiences. The level of rigor and articulation of their architecture, I think, is difficult to match anywhere. And their care for each project is not seated in some style or ideology, but rather, if I could risk a personal read, the overarching ideological approach for Neri & Hu, at least from my vantage, is simply a deep commitment to the work at hand and what richness could be had in the in the inhabitation of space. I feel very privileged to have such quality in the building tonight, and so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lyndon Neri.
Can you hear me? I'm supposed to look up, but I can't see him. Okay, I'm going to do this. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mark, for your very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I want to thank Dean Poole, Director Jason Young, who until yesterday I thought was Chinese. I've heard of him from many friends and for many years, and for the longest time I thought he was Chinese, and that's probably the reason why I accepted this invitation. And then when I realized that perhaps tonight he was not going to take me to a Chinese restaurant, I was disappointed. But I want to thank the school and everyone for the kind invitation to give this lecture tonight. I am Lyndon Neri, and I apologize that my partner, Rossana, who is truly the better half, the smarter half, and the taller half, the prettier half. But, you know, I'm the one who came to Tennessee, so you got to give me the credit. She can't come tonight, but we are a firm base in Shanghai. This is our office. I always like to show this office partially because you see when you have a group of people in China that gathers together, the cops start circling around your office, and that's the truth. They just don't like the idea of people gathering together and talk about things that they're not supposed to. So I'm just going to show you a quick film of our office. We no longer are there. We got kicked out after 10 years. The place we come from sets the stage for many of our architectural and design exploration. We want to share that condition with you tonight as a contextual framework from which to understand our operative modes as architects. We bring forth a few issues that started out as problems we needed to confront with while working on projects. Then they became obsessions that kept coming back again and again, surfacing and resurfacing, sometimes consciously, other times completely unintentionally. These obsessions, many of which have started 15 years ago, 13 years ago when we started our practice, and they've developed, evolved, and we're going to discuss one of these obsessions tonight. You may find the following an oversimplification of the China condition, but for expediency and clarity, I'm going to focus on these examinations. We have to deal with urban issues, the rapid development and demolition of the city that we practice. We have to deal with rural issues, disappearing villages, and the heritage that comes with it. And last but not the least, inheriting the remnants of China's industrial heritage, an opportunity to reutilize artifacts of excess through adaptive reuse. And in many ways, we're showing you this office because we thought we were not going to, given our connection with the government, that we might actually not be kicked out. We were close to the mayor's office, we were close to the mayor. Even that did not stop them from kicking us out because it was time for us to move on. And they don't give you reasons, they just give you a month notice. This is a condition that is not just a reality, it's a condition we have to deal with. Because of time, and I know you guys are all not jet lagged, but you guys are, I'm jet lagged. But I feel like I have an all-nighter, so you can see my English is not quite there. If I speak Chinese, please forgive me. I'm going to stop there because I think we have about 7 films, so don't be discouraged that the first film was cut short. Urban issues, rapid development and demolition. So this particular image between 2000 to 2010, urban land expanded by 83%, urban population grew by 45%. This image of Jiazhangke depicts that whole notion of a new city that rises from the ashes. Kandiv Nader's image of Chongqing, which is middle of China, here it shows us that with urbanization changing the landscape of cities and altering the texture of daily life, it gives rise to new notions of urban leisure. So people on weekends, this is in many ways the central park of Chongqing. By 2020, 60% of China's population will be living in urban areas. That's approximately 800 million people. At the same time, rural issues, disappearing village culture, and in many ways, a part of our heritage goes with it. Between 2000 to 2010, the number of villages dropped from 3.7 million to 2.6 million, an average of 300 villages lost per day. That's outstanding. That's really crazy. Not because the government's demolishing them, but because there's an influx of people going to the city, and therefore villages are left with the elderly and the super young. So China's vernacular villages were formed based on family ideals. Confucian family ideals were clan-based settlements, created clusters of home, giving rise to traditional village. Without that traditional family setting, many of these villages will not only erode, but it will disappear. In addition to the urbanization plan, the Ministry of Housing and Urban-Rural Development has made a vital list of historic villages dependent on the age of the structure and the intangible cultural heritage that exists within. And in that list, the catalog of 9,700 examples of intangible cultural heritage, 80% are in the rural area, not in the city. And yet many people are moving to the city and leaving what is deemed as cultural, intangible cultural heritage to rot by itself. This particular artwork is quite daunting. Only 40% of rural migrants are willing to return to their farms, only 3% among those born after 1990. Each empty chair representing an absent family member who has left the village to pursue opportunities in urban centers. The next issue is adaptive reuse, dealing with excess. Many of our projects fall under the category of adaptive reuse and deal with local history and culture. In much of our work, there is the recurrent theme of juxtaposing old and new, reinterpretation of local typologies, and a desire to celebrate and elevate the mundane. In fact, we were a victim, as I was telling you, of that just a few months ago when we were evicted from our office of 10 years. 1 out of 6 families in China have been evicted and relocated since early 1990s. This is the context in which Neri and Hu intentionally situates itself. As Mark had said, as a practice, we are constantly trying to insert meaning into our work by drawing from these contexts, both in geography and history. For that, we often find ourselves looking at the past. In other words, working with the notion of nostalgia. And this is the obsession, this is one obsession I want to talk about. Given the time limitation and the projects I want to show, I want to focus on this particular terminology, reflective nostalgia. As early as 14 years ago, when we started the firm in Shanghai, we became interested and almost obsessed with the notion of nostalgia. We gained useful insight from a critical examination of the term and its origins, theories that surrounds it, applications in various forms of disciplines, and the various architectural extensions and possibilities this reading offers us. Nostalgia is a learned formation of a Greek compound consisting of nostos, meaning homecoming, a Homeric word, and algos, meaning pain or ache. Coined around the end of 17th century as a medical term, nostalgia was thought to be a disease, commonly afflicting soldiers and sailors who, forced to leave their homelands, began to manifest symptoms such as fainting, high fever, and even death, all later attributed to actual physical illness. It was only towards the first half of the 19th century that nostalgia began to attain its current modern meaning, both in literary and everyday usage. Now commonly understood as a sentimentality of the past, it should be noted that the object of longing is transferred from the concreteness of place to the invariably abstract notion of time. Time being irreversible, the past being forever past, nostalgia can only be defined as the presence of an absence. So if you look at the photograph to the left by Michael Wolff of a cityscape in Hong Kong, and yet if you go to Bangkok or Shenzhen, or many of the major metropolis in Shanghai, it's actually very similar. It produces anonymous cities and the destruction of local culture. Image on the right is the lane in Shanghai that actually starts to create that vibrancy and difference. When you go to Bangkok, when you go to Shanghai, or when you go to Beijing, it is the street life that starts to differentiate you from the anonymous building. And this is where we're very interested in. Aldo Rossi had this quote, "Does the union between the past and the future exist in the very idea of the city that it flows through, in the same way that memories flows through the life of a person? And always, in order to be realized, this idea must not only shape, but be shaped by reality. This shaping is a permanent aspect of a city's unique artifacts, monuments, and the idea we have of it." In the architecture of the city, here Aldo Rossi offers us a hint when he articulates memory as a flow and the past and future of the city as a flow. But are we being too naive? Is this overly nostalgic, longing for something that must go away, holding on to a romantic notion of the past that may have never existed? Yet, we're very comforted and reassured of Svetlana Boym, which unfortunately she passed away about 4 years ago, and she talks about the difference of restorative nostalgia and reflective nostalgia. And in here, we, as a practice, absolutely understand, not only understand, but resonate. Restorative nostalgia resonates well with us, is more literal. The reflective nostalgia resonates with us as opposed to restorative nostalgia. It thrives on the longing itself and delays the homecoming. Wistfully, ironically, desperately, it does not follow a single plot, but explore ways of inhabiting many places at once. In imagining different time zones, it loves details, not symbols. So for a lot of us, if you've seen a lot of our interior work, oftentimes people think we celebrate ruins, but ruins makes us think of the past that could have been and the future that never took place. And as Svetlana, in her book, as she coined the word ruinophilia, talks about the tantalizing notion of the utopian dreams of escaping the irreversibility of time. At the same time, she said, the fascination of ruin is not merely intellectual, but also sensual. Ruins give us a shock of vanishing materiality. In our projects that deal with historic sites and existing buildings, we have been known to celebrate a ruin. There is certainly the power of the visceral experience of a decaying surface whose history is written into every crack and crevice. But that alone puts it in danger of mere sentimental manipulation, or even less critically, a matter of style. So for us, ruin is more than just sentimentality. It's a way of understanding, perhaps a part of history, a sense of reflection that allows us to understand the future. The key for us is actually in the relationship between old and new, not simply to put relics on a pedestal for worship when we choose to keep a section of a crumbling wall, like the previous slide, for example. We often frame and encase it behind glass in an archival fashion, or juxtapose it directly against a section of a smooth white wall. This is a way to distance oneself from the actual material reality of the wall. Instead of focusing on the thing itself, the intention is to highlight our desire or longing for it and what it represents. Many of these images, some of our restaurants have that sort of sensibility. Sometimes it is simply inserting new doors, windows, lighting fixtures, and built-in furniture to bring about this tension between old and new. We've inherited a lot of historical buildings that we can't touch, so in many ways it's using doors, windows, and lighting fixtures as apparatus to create this tension. This is a restaurant for John George in Shanghai on a listed historical building along the Bund. And you can kind of see many of our insertion in which some of the buildings, as raw as they are, can't be touched. I will talk a little bit about our hotel project later, again dealing with old and new. For a museum project in Kuala Lumpur that we recently won, we were given a shell of an existing building. This building was the former office of the British Planning Department that was in charge of the master planning of the Malaya Railway network when Singapore and Malaysia was one. And by merely inserting and having this tension through that circulation, we allow this experience for people to experience old and new. We inserted all our program into the existing building. The public experience is along the perimeter, which also serves as the main connector for the museum. When you are in this space, you experience both the old and the new. These are some of the images. For a competition we won in London for the Magistrate Courthouse in Covent Garden. This was a listed building, so we could not touch the exterior in front. So this was at the back. We focused our proposal by adding an insertion within by creating this lattice brickwork to bring about a new life in this new hotel conversion. Some of our project deals with typology, the lane house typology, the courtyard houses typology, or even down south, what we called in Fujian the tulo typology, which is the round circular courthouses. That to the left, the slide to the left is an image of our camper office, the camper office store in Shanghai, capturing a frame opening into a double height atrium where shoes are hung and displayed, reminiscent of the glimpses one could get in an old alleyway house, shown in the Robert van der Hilst image on the right. And again, that is a sectional quality of that lane house, interpreted obviously in an abstract manner. Sometimes we play with the notion of attic that is common in Shanghai lane houses, in our design for interior spaces for creative agency. And I will talk a little bit more about this project later, but in our practice we often examine vernacular typologies such as the Li Nong that have persisted for centuries and generations, or the courtyard houses up north. Our research and investigation into these typologies has been a fertile means of being critical in our understanding in how to tie our projects into a broader historical context and lineage. The courtyard houses originating in the northern regions of China, for example, reveals the inseparable relationship between humans and nature, the integration of public and private space, as well as the familial hierarchy which shapes every aspect of Chinese living. And sometimes we play with the study of investigation and research, not only in typologies, but also vernacular construction materials and methods. Similarly, as with the approach to typology, the idea is not to transplant an outdated modality directly into our projects, rather than to interpret them anew. Both traditional architecture as well as modern rural architecture is being constructed with extremely humble materials: brick, concrete, plaster. And the construction is extremely rough, but there is a certain beauty and simplicity within this roughness that should be embraced rather than looked down upon. If you try to do work in Japan and try to ask them to do rough things, it's almost impossible, just like the Chinese could never do a perfect, simple wall. So you have to celebrate what they're good at. So the first project I want to show you, in light of the obsession I want to talk about, is a house that we were commissioned about 12 years ago. And you have to remember, our practice is about 14 years old, and by then I didn't really have any architecture work. So in fact, this was considered our first architectural work. And when someone came to me, this man from Hong Kong, he had asked me to do this house, and his brief was very simple. I'm going to come to Shanghai over the weekend with two of my friends, and we're going to find ourselves. Through this house, we're going to find ourselves, the meaning of life and what the purpose is. When someone gives you a brief like that, you don't ask questions. You just said, perfect, well, do whatever it takes. But you have to remember, this was a lane house. So a lot of lane houses, as I mentioned before, they were the dominant fabric that made urban Shanghai the intoxicating place that it was in the 1930s. But many of these buildings were rapidly being demolished. And by now, only a third of them are in place in the center of the city. They're taken over by high-density developments all over the city. And so you kind of see this condition, very interesting, dense city condition, And this is the site map. So what we did was we went to a section that is commonly seen in caricatures or cartoons of lane houses, and it's always split level. So our strategy was to rethink the typology of the lane house, keeping the split level formation, a typical trait to lane houses in this city, and add spatial interest through new insertion and skylight to highlight the architectural integrity of such a typology, contemporizing it for today's lifestyle. So if you look at the floor plan, so when we naturally present this, he was not convinced because he was planning to stay on the third floor, one of his friend on the second and the other on the first floor, and they would come once a month. So there are two distinct spaces. The servants are usually living behind, and up front would be the main house. And so what we did was we took the most private part of the house, which are the toilet and the bathroom, and put it next to the most public space, which is the stairway. And we argued that this is probably where his friends or he himself will be exposed to them while showering. And of course, we're not that crazy. We have curtains, but he was even crazier than I was because he decided that curtain was not needed. So to keep the spirit of that, you will see in the picture, to keep the spirit of the typology alive, a new continuous metal stair was inserted to replace the old decaying wooden stair that was not to code. And you can kind of see our diagram. And so here, this is the picture. To keep these spaces pure and rigorous, all toilets were inserted into the new, next to the stair spaces. And you can kind of see as you go up. And yes, trust me, there are curtain tracks. But then he was really excited when I did this because obviously he lived on the third floor, so he has control over his own bathroom, but not his friends. And he figured if it's his house and they're staying with him, that he controls. And with that kind of interplay between client and architect, I don't even dare ask his sexuality. And that was just not important to me, as long as I get to do what I wanted to do. And so these were imaged. The bathroom, conceivably the most intimate spaces of each apartment, are inserted next to the most public. Stairways separated only with not really a sandblasted, hardly sandblasted glass divider. So, and you can kind of see what we did, the layer of this particular, this is a rooftop image. Architecturally, the decorative elements added over the last 60 years were stripped off, and large openings were created on the frontal section to improve light qualities to the public spaces of each apartment. It is as if we have sliced off 60 years of time and now forces the building to embrace its community without a mask, without a facade, literally. Urbanistically, it is reshaping the Linong typology with the transparency and modernity that fulfills the vitality of contemporary life. At the same time, when your neighbors could gaze into your everyday life, you have the city open to your private viewing as well. The city becomes your art. And in many ways, the notion of nostalgia here, in line within its reflective vein, subverts the idea that nostalgia could only look backwards towards the past. We do believe that to long for what's lost also has the capacity to create something new. And you can imagine how excited he was with this particular condition. Unfortunately, he passed away after he moved in, a month after he moved in. It was rather sad. He wrote me a very nice letter. And of course, 2 months later, his wife came to our office and said, "Lyndon, I'd like to know what my husband's brief was for this house." As an architect, you have to know how to tell stories, but you have to know how to do constructive lies. So I said, this was supposed to be a surprise for you, a birthday, a birthday gift for you. I didn't really know her birthday, but I just pulled a fast one, and she was quite touched. But you have to do anything, even to save a marriage. That's important. The second project I want to show you is actually within the vein of total design, which we often use as one of our obsession. But this is flagship store in Korea, in North Korea. When a North Korean company comes and as a Chinese practice to do their headquarters, you have to really question their sanity. Because historically, two countries never really, not as bad as Japan and China, but Japan and Korea is not the best either. So when they come and approach us, we thought they wanted to do their headquarters in Shanghai, which would logically make sense. But to do it in the Gangnam area, which is basically in New York, it would be the Soho equivalent in New York. I was quite surprised. And so we proposed this idea of lanterns. And so if you look at our analogy, I think I don't necessarily need to lantern, as an identity, as a journey, and as a memory. So what we did was we said, what if we create the idea of this inserted lantern, the structure itself becomes the poche, and the poche itself becomes the structure as well. And so when you go up and down the stairway, you don't really need walls within. And we were allowed to demolish the existing building, but he was a good friend of mine, a fairly famous Korean architect, so I thought to keep that relationship alive, it was important that we just did the interior. So you can kind of see how the model works. And that's the image of this particular project. And, I actually have a movie here that will be able to tell you. And it's interesting because this flagship, I don't know if you've heard of Sohwaso. You probably have not, because a lot of New Yorkers have not heard of it, so I don't think down here in the South people probably have heard of Sohwaso. Nothing against the South. But it is basically like La Mer of Asia. It's very expensive. And obviously this group, it's called Amor Pacific, owns 24 of these cosmetic brands. So when you think you're buying Sohwaso or you're buying other brands thinking that it's their competitors, it's all theirs. So their main headquarters was recently designed by David Chipperfield and was just completed. So you might have seen this white box, quite beautifully done. But he was quite an enlightened client, and his goal was to make sure that all the furnitures were designed by us, but we couldn't really do that, so we did the rugs designed by us, that chair is designed by us, but obviously that bench is by Arne Jacobsen. So we start convincing him that it can't just be all near and who, as much as my ego sometimes would entice me to go the other route. And so we did, when there's the core, we actually clad it with stainless, high-gloss stainless steel, so you actually see sort of this eternity. And this was one project in which all the lights and these apparatus, this wall supposedly grid, the structure that forms the grid of the lantern also serves as the apparatus for all the display and lighting equipment. But I have this movie. You hear the music? It's important. We've also started as a practice to do film. About 6 years ago, we made a conscious effort because we know not a lot of people can really travel to these projects. And I think drawing and pictures is not enough. I'm not saying film is perfect, but I think it comes closer to the real space. And I think architecture, it's important for us that architecture is a spatial experience and you understand how you move from one space to another. So on the ground floor, it's a museum. This exhibition is not run by us because it's this ginseng root that is the base of this particular cosmetic brand. It's supposed to make you a lot younger. I remember those chairs are designed by us. I remember when the studio have a museum down below. The second and third floor is basically a clinic, a center for rehabilitation. The rooftop is a restaurant, and the basement is a spa treatment place for this particular brand. So you go in and it's an immersive experience with this brand. So you don't just buy, they want you to experience it. So you can kind of actually see from the first floor all the way to the third floor, and oftentimes actually there's no walls, so these serves as well. I'm sure if this was in the US, we probably need some railings, but thank goodness we're in South Korea. And this allows us as a practice to also really delve into sort of an interdisciplinary approach. A lot of these furnitures are designed with different brands. Allows us to customize pieces, especially when it's part of That's supposed to wake you up in case you're tired. So the next one is going to be a movie as well, okay, guys? So there's a movie night here tonight. That way I don't have to speak as much. I notice my English already start to slur and start to using wrong words, but since Rossana can't come, and I notice that there are product designers that are coming in here, I'm going to show you a product design we did about 7 years ago, and you will see truly my better half.
It's the first time we worked with auto industry to develop a product, and we wanted to have a product that has the aspect of, high tech and using carbon fiber and exploring the limits of that material through its structure qualities. The product is a picnic basket for someone who might drive a Jaguar on a weekend to a park.
When we were asked to do this project, we had to think of a number of things. One was Jaguar and its relevance to it being British. So naturally the picnic basket came to mind. But being Chinese designers, obviously, we had to do something that somewhat relate to the context where we practice. So we thought, what would be something similar to a picnic basket in a Chinese context? So we thought of biandang, which is a lunchbox. It's interesting because we were trying to also create an object that will be incorporated into Jaguar. And since the interior of a Jaguar is already so perfect, we thought a picnic basket would be a great addition. From a tea set to a candle holder to a necklace to a wooden plate. Things that are very Chinese in many ways.
There's a lot of thinking behind, how the inside of the box is related to the outside. There are these openings of lines that allow you to see through to the interior of the box. So there's a lot of architectural qualities to this piece.
I think this is one piece that allowed us actually as architects to explore the spatial quality of an object in sort of its sectional form, but at the same time the blurriness of public and private is also seen through this piece. So when you're carrying this piece outside, in many ways people can see a glimpse of what you're carrying, what you're going to actually eat that day, or what that kind of celebration you're going to have. The next project is a chapel in Suzhou. Suzhou is about 2 hours away from Shanghai, and you will see this in the map. It's west of Shanghai, and the client came, sorry, that image is rather blurry. The client came to us and had hired and wanted an American architect by the name of Chow Macau from New York to do a hotel. And that finger, that long finger, is they've hired Yong Ho Chang to do villas, and we were asked to do the smaller finger to the right, and at the same time we did that village to the left. And they had an older village, and what they wanted to do was incorporate the old village with the new village that they've created. But in the middle of it, there was this chapel. And when the client came and said, "Do you want to do this?" Because they want to make it a feature building within the larger village zone, obviously it became quite exciting to us. It not only occupies a prime location, visible from the main road, it allows us to do a public space that would be quite interesting from a cultural point of view. So as I was telling you a while ago, we start launching into, not so recent, but maybe 5 years ago, research not only on vernacular typology, but also vernacular construction methods. And so we thought in the Jiangsu area, what better to actually, in this wet climate of Jiangsu, to take on these soft greens and gray. Some of you might call it mold, but we call it the brushstroke of a Chinese ink painting, or at least that's what I told the client. And so similarly as with the approach to typology, the idea here is to take then these recycled brick, these old bricks that were demolished from close by villages, in fact comprised of 3 villages, and bring about a new interpretation of how the brick reading would be manifested. So this is a few sketches that I actually did, some models, a section, and you see there's that different level. So its architectural language is derived from similar elements found elsewhere in the projects, such as the undulating brick walls and floating white volume that we had done for the villa next door, but they are here taken to another level of articulation. The brick walls begin to break down to an even more refined scale, where different heights of walls interweave with each other to create a choreographed landscape journey leading into the building itself. So the white volume here receives a special treatment. It is composed of 2 layers. The inner layer is a simple box punctuated on all sides with scattered windows, while the outer layer is a folded and perforated metal skin, a veil, which alternatively hides and reveals. In the daytime, the white box emerges shimmering gently in the sunlight. In a subtle way, it exposes its content. At night, the white box becomes a jewel-like beacon in the projects. Its various windows emitting a soft glow in all directions. When you see some of these images, and there's this path that leads you down on a sloping site along the river. And these are the circulation and some of the images. But what was interesting was sort of the side of the chapel, which is this grand stairway that was really the fire escape, but at the same time we made it into a bigger and wider public space. And in China, you can't, when you have a space of worship, you need to give people another alternative space. That's mandatory by the Ministry of Religion. You can't just have one place of assembly. You need to give people an outlet just in case they don't feel comfortable. And so this sense of nostalgia for us that once was very important in a Chinese community, which is the notion of assembling, is constantly challenged. So you will see that we spent just equal amount of time in this particular space. As you walk up and down, it's actually, you can't really tell, it looks like concrete, but it's terrazzo all the way to where the handrail is, and the rest is concrete. There's a bronze detail along the path. So we took just as much care with the space outside of the main chapel and create sectional quality to this space that would be conducive as you go up to the rooftop garden. And obviously this is the interior. The building visitor continues on this guided journey through the pre-function area and then into this main chapel space, which features a light-filled 12-meter high space all clad in wood. There's a seamless integration with the surrounding nature as picture windows frames various man-made and natural landscape. A mezzanine level hovers overhead to accommodate extra guests and includes a catwalk encircling the space, allowing 360-degree of viewing angles. The mezzanine is integrated into a wood-louvered cage element which wraps around the whole upper part of the room. There is also a gridded custom light fixture to give it that sense of layer and delicate detail that allows. So I had an opportunity once to take a number of high school kids to a and look at that main space. They would not enter it. It's not a space they recognize or a space they would recognize. But that side stair that is large public space, people walking down, they could look at public space, something they understand. Glimpses from the side room, you see the space there that allows that next generation to be able to be reflective and to understand that sense of nostalgia that we are aspiring to do. We can't force people to immediately understand sort of this sense of sacredness or a place of repose. It's easy for Chinese students that live particularly in America to understand this, but many in the city where we practice, this is not common. So by creating this side space, which you will see later, it gives this aperture that allows you to see that main space. Many of these younger generations are starting to slowly understand that perhaps it's not as intimidating, or perhaps it's a space that the So it's hard to see the details, to see the demarcation of the terrazzo. I'm going to skip that. I'm not so sure if I have that much time, so I might skip this project. I'm going to go through it rather fast. This is a garage project. Interestingly enough, in Beijing, a city of 26 million inhabitants and 7 million vehicles, being trapped in a car in Beijing, notorious traffic is a compulsory experience in the capital city. If you think LA is bad, try Beijing. This is even worse. Our project here is in a former missile factory right in the heart of Beijing. Think about contradiction and future next to the Temple of Earth. Thank goodness it's not being used anymore. Thank goodness it's only a trade war, and we don't have to deal with missiles. I'm just joking. But so these were some of the conditions that we dealt with. And so the client came to us wanting to build a service center, but a very different service center. He decided that it can't just be an auto mechanic place, but a place wherein a car would come in and be treated like you would go to a medical clinic. So trying to attempt to recapture the allure and magic that was once associated with cars. So adding cultural functions such as design gallery with a cafe and offices. The project as a whole is conceived as a workshop space, partly raw and partly refined. It is activated throughout with the energy and spirit of the industrial area. So some of these images, and we created something on top. This is a model. We build a lot of models in our office. In fact, this is rather large model to understand. This is the finished model, but there's a lot of sort of cardboard model while we're designing. So there's a demonstrating here a certain tectonic candor, the tripartite of elements, existing brick building, steel structural frame, and inserted white volume are visually distinct and legible on the facade. So here is the floor plan. What's interesting is there's this car elevator that lifts you up next to the cafe. It's actually right in the middle, sandwiched from his office and the cafe and the cultural arts center or a gallery place. And so this is a project in which we were also employed as graphic designers. I know this is also a graphic design school, so forgive us if our graphic is not as good. I thought it was an architecture lecture that I'm giving, so please don't judge me on this. And I've also convinced the client that B+ is just not a good name. But it's just as bad as A-. But he refused to listen to me. So I'm like, if I go lecturing the US, this just would not sound well for your brand. And he's like, well, my brand is not for the US, so it's okay. So you kind of see what we did with the cafe and the lift gallery and some of the details that comes with it. Many of these furnitures we've designed for brands. And so our attitude was, as we design many of these furnitures in conjunction with the architecture and interior, it is seen as total design. It is seen as a whole. So you see from his office, he looks down and can actually look at all the workers at play. So these are the details, and you kind of see where we are. So custom furniture, as I was saying, and lighting pieces adopt the efficient tectonic and wood plank and tubular steel construction, but their material richness and refined detailing also hearken to the quality of craftsmanship found in antique cars, which he had a lot of. And so here we try to break through common expectation of what some might consider a vulgar typology to inject a sense of warmth into an industrial context. I have a movie here, but you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to skip this one, if you guys don't mind, because I think we're running out of time, and most of you will be hungry despite the Papa John's you had. The next project is interesting. It's Shanghai Theater. This was a project from the government, and so I was really excited when we were given this project, and because it was in the theater district. The fee was very low, but being a typical architect, anything with a theater or museum in front of it, you just said yes. And when they told me where the site is, I was really excited. And that's the site right there. That was the image that I was shown. And they said, look, this is what happened. This was the former theater. It has lost its grandeur and allure, and we want to bring this back. And I said, is it still there? They said, no, it's no longer there. But I still want, there's still remnants of it that we want to save. If you guys read Chinese, here it tells you sort of the significance of this theater. It's not big, even though it says it's a big theater. And so in the 90s, that beautiful theater that you saw became this, okay? And so when I saw this image, I'm like, well, maybe it's salvageable, maybe it's okay. Well, when I went to the site, it was this, okay? So you can imagine no 3D printing was going to help this cause. And so I was really worried. And I said, it's no longer a theater. They made it into a movie theater. And I said, look, how are we, can we strip it back to its simplicity? And so I started sketching, and from the street, the building reads as a heavy stone, I argued, and this volume hovering just above the ground level, lodged firmly between each neighbor. It announces its present in a very, hopefully, silent way. So you see what we did. And drawing inspiration from the theatrical acts which takes place within, the carved spaces of the interior and exterior atriums were conceptualized as series of dramatic scenes. Now, when we presented to the client, he's always thought that there was a wall, a glass wall in front. And in my drawing, I made it really blurry, because I knew I was gonna, if they were gonna pay me with such a low fee, I'm gonna give a bit of their building back to the public. And so that was important to me. And therefore, they also thought that was a skylight. And I keep saying, we'll get there. And of course, it's just an opening. So these scenes of varying spatial and lighting configuration are experienced as one moves throughout the space, intensifying as one explores deeper into the building. And you'll see sectionally. The sad thing was the theater was a black box. So they said, don't touch that. You're only touching that building in between the street and this block box. So we get to only play. People often ask me, where's the theater, Lyndon? I said, well, there's really no theater because it's a pre-theater. So we then we made the most out of this by creating, as you can kind of you'll see in the images, to guide the theater goers into the building. We create this bronze abstracted notion reading like a curtain. It's fluted bronze walls, really reminiscent of a theater curtain, cloaking the drama of the main stage behind it. Provide a sense of weightlessness in contrast to the heaviness of the stone above. We open light and let it filter in. These bronze curtains leads you into the theater, setting the stage of the pre-theater affairs like a foreplay before the real show. So here we are. The problem was, when it opened, I managed to get the mind that we did the glass here. A lot of people, the government was getting a lot of comments from the public saying it's like a little park and street, so they love it. But the problem was people start parking their car in front of us. Much to my demise. So what I did was I had to have my staff there for about a month to make sure to tell them that cars are not allowed. So architecture is more than just drawing and conceiving spaces. We need to be, we're very controlling with our space. That was not staged, by the way. This is my king, photographer. the next project is what we call the vertical lane house, water house, and some of you might have known us through this project. In fact, this was probably our first or second architectural project. This was done about 9 years ago. A client came to us and said, do you want to do a project on the Bund? I don't know how many of you have been to Shanghai, but when someone tells you to design a project on the Bund, there's only 33 historical buildings. So obviously the egotistical side of me said, I'm going to be part of history. I'm going to design one of these 33 buildings. And so I was really excited without really even researching. I said, yes, we'll do it. Well, he took me to the south of Bund. And this was the building he showed me. And I was really shocked because the glamour of 1930s Bund quickly dissipated in my mind, and I had to salvage those buildings. And I said to myself, maybe I should demolish. Well, the second request from him made me even more nervous, because he said, Professor Neri, can you do a building that looks like Mayfair in London? I'm like, why would you want to do that? So, but I, out of respect, and you never tell a Chinese client that he's stupid. You never say that. However, you can say a number of things, just in case in the future you have projects in China. You can say, let me save you money by saving this building. That trick will work throughout history, and it will continue to work, okay? Chinese, anytime you tell them they'll save them money and will make them money, they'll say yes. So I said, if you save this building and forget the brick and forget Mayfair, I'll give you a nice building, you'll save half. Obviously, I lied. And so we start researching. Since I opened my mouth, by this time, we decided that since this is our first few projects, that we want to attempt a different kind of preservation. And so we said to ourselves, well, as we were sketching this, I said we were interested in the idea of people coming to this hotel and understanding what it is to be a tourist or a traveler as opposed to a tourist. A tourist would come to a city and they would have their checklist of things to see, and then they would leave and think that they have seen the city and understand the city. A traveler would try to understand the essence of the city. So I love this Calvino quote, which explains a lot of what this project is all about. Some Chinese text here. And so we start saying, sorry, that Chinese text not supposed to be there. I got mixed with my Chinese lecture notes and English. But so we start telling the client, what if we start celebrating people washing their clothes on the street, brushing their teeth, eating on the sidewalk? And I argued, it's an interesting phenomenon, because when you go to Paris and you eat on the sidewalk, it's called romantic. But in Shanghai, it's called unhygienic. So it's kind of strange. So I said, why don't we do this? And of course, he thought I was really crazy. He's like, I need to make money out of this. I said, you will, because a lot of people from the West would really eat this up. And so I said, start, having to have all these clothes. And also another thing was the idea of being voyeuristic. Not in a perverted way, but to actually go back to history and that sense of reflective nostalgia, because if you're in lane houses in China, you actually see people cooking, you could see people showering, and it's really complex sectional quality, but it's interesting. The Lilong places in Shanghai, it's extremely, the public and the private are completely blurred. In fact, I live in an old lane house, and my bathroom, of course, I'm a modernist, so I have this big window, and looks out about 5 feet away is an old lady and her kitchen. So sometimes I forget to close my curtain, and she gets to see me, and I have to pretend. That's always been intentional. And so I noticed that she's watching me, because when she says things in the courtyard, she would say, you really gain a lot of weight. So it's just not but this is the reality we lived in, wherein people actually would throw garbage into your garden, and what you do is, instead of telling them not to do, you take that garbage and throw it back to their garden. And by having this mitigation or negotiation, passive negotiation, you actually start to appreciate each other. And so what we did was looked the plan. The plan looks rather simple, but I'm going to show you something. So if you stay in this hotel, be careful because all the bathroom are actually quite sectional, and you get to see each other in a nice sort of voyeuristic. So it's located by the Cool Docks development on the south of the Bund. The Waterhouse is a 4-story, 19-room boutique hotel built into an existing 3-story Japanese Army headquarters building from the 1930s. The boutique hotel fronts the Huangpu River and looks across Pudong, which is the major city that you probably see, or the city that you often see when people are depicting Shanghai as this glamorous city. So we deal with old and new, public and private, the idea of context here and trying to preserve it. And this is the lobby. I'm going to tell you a story about this lobby. My mother came after this was done, and he says, "Son, is this project done?" I said, "I think so. Do you have a problem with it, Mom?" And she said, "There's two things. You're either a genie." Well, no, the second question was, "Did the client pay you in full?" And I said, "Yes, he did." And so she concluded by saying that you're either a genius or the client is really stupid. So what's the lesson learned from there? Even your own parents that pays your education sometimes do not understand what you do in architecture school. We were responsible in designing for everything, and it allows us, because there were 3 buildings here really, so you can see sort of the ramps that kind of mediate between the different sectional quality of the building. We left a lot of the old sort of patina intentionally, and the idea of preservation was done in a different way. We were kind of shocked when, after this was built, the mayor came and some of the government officials, they were quite upset. And in fact, we lost 2 major competition because, not competition, commission. We already had those projects, but those 2 clients came and like, I'm not so sure if you're the right architect. I'm not even sure if you went to architecture school. And so I was really devastated until Lady Gaga, on one of her Shanghai tour, booked the whole hotel, all 19 room, and 2 weeks later, David Beckham, the soccer star, came and booked the whole room, booked the whole hotel, and all of a sudden, the cultural minister said, maybe this hotel is more hip than we think. And it became part of the front cover of Shanghai's tourism for 5 years. We knew then that the whole idea of reflective nostalgia with this reflective vein in mind actually has something that resonate well with them, hopefully, and not just because they're superstars that are staying here. But these are confront issues. So you can kind of see balconies, and you will look up and you can actually see, and again, these are different rooms, shared terraces, like a lane house, typical of a lane house, extremely sectional. And you see the restaurant down below, and there's section cuts. Well, the section cuts look up to the bedrooms. And so I told the client, you don't need artwork. The people that pay the room becomes your artwork. And they really like that idea. And so you see this blurring the restaurant. And this is one of the section that looks up to the bedroom. Bedroom to the right and bedroom to the left from the restaurant. And again, we also preserve the existing stairway. It was considered not just a Japanese headquarter for a company, but it was also an opium den. So a lot of people actually keep drugs here. And so they created all these different stairway that some of them leads to room and some leads to nowhere as a way to run away from authorities. And so we actually kept that. That's not a good idea for you guys when you do architecture, but we just preserved it. And so you see sort of the character of this. This is not a mirror. This is a room next door. So parents, if you have kids, this is a perfect way to control them. And we used recycled from the roof, recycled wood. So this was when it was just finished, so it was rather septic. Now it's completely full of life and vegetation. And I have this movie that will be able to tell you a little bit more of so many of our videos actually do not script. We actually try to video as how something bad, which is real bad. The restaurant is this happens all the time. Watching you obviously young and stupid. That's the best way to do this money on the This next image will show you how close you are in terms of the proximity to the living river. That brings the molecules back and forth. Center of transmission rather melts There's also a lot of graphics component here in terms of text. Not just restaurants that we like, given that this is all about like travelers Two more projects and we're done, I promised. The next project is called the Walled Qingpu Yangzhou Resort. Interestingly enough, this project is about 3 hours by train. You need to take a train to a relatively distant space and then drive an hour and a half, so it's about 2.5 hours, called Yangzhou. And it's famous for a few things. One of them is called the Ge Garden and also the silver slender lake. And this developer was really quite a visionary. He believes that properties like the Great Wall, you can't just preserve the Great Wall, you can't just preserve the Summer Palace, but you also need to preserve rural village area and rural sites that are significant. So obviously with that mantra, and he had hired 5 Chinese architects and 5 Japanese architects and taken 10 sites and do these different things. So it was rather exciting. But then when I went to the site, it was a garbage, literally. The slender lake was not so slender, and the beautiful lake that was conveyed to me in the brief was really a garbage dump. And this was the condition of the site. But what was so sad about it was the fact that the footprint was to remain, and it was the government's regulation to keep the footprint, not the building, which is a very strange logic. But you don't question the government or the planning bureau when they say such a thing. In America, you might be able to question. In China, I just said, let me think about it. So the brief called for adaptive reuse of this several building footprint. The building you can demolish, but not the footprint. So what we did was we started looking at Yangzhou and some of the historical traditional typology that's in there. And especially this particular house in the city of Yangzhou. Actually, it's by the Ge Garden. There is this beautiful house where it's series of walls, and traditionally in Yangzhou there were many of these. So what we did was we created a diagram by creating the idea of courtyard houses, the wall, and how the alleyway brings this to life. And so in order to tie the whole space together, our strategy was to unify these scattered elements by overlaying a grid of walls that you see in the traditional Yangzhou village and path onto the site to tie the entire projects together, resulting in multiple courtyard enclosure. The inspiration for the design originates, as I said, within that old historical town, many of which are no longer there with the exception of two. And so you see the floor plan and the program that comes with it, and by creating this grid, it allows us, even though the footprints were different, the grid made the spaces, made it a unified space. So here's the building. Actually, we have new pictures of it now, full of vegetation. In fact, I was just there with my students from Harvard, and they were all filled with vegetation now, so it's actually a lot nicer. This is kind of after construction was done, so it looks rather bare. Obviously, the vegetation is in full swing. So in several recent projects, we have employed recycled bricks, and in this particular case, we did it again. So we collected from demolition sites around the region and reassembled in various bond patterns. The brick walls add a textual reading, and over time, their patina continues to build. And you see what I'm trying to do, different images. Project like the chapel, which I showed you a while ago, begins to emerge as if having been there for many generations. One could say that the collection and repositioning of old bricks is not merely an act of being sustainable. It also carries the idea of conserving time through curating the marks of history tectonically on a building's facade. And you see the layering that unfolds by having many of these particular spaces. Within the walls, several of the courtyards are occupied by guest rooms and other shared amenities such as the reception, library, and restaurant. Many of the building roof lines are confined within the height of the walls surrounding them so that they are not visible from afar. So this is a public theater, the outdoor theater I was telling you, many of different courtyards. Journeying along the walls, guests can also ascend through openings above to gain privileged vantage point that look out across the gridded landscape and beyond to the surrounding lakes. Hotel guests traverse the site using the walled pathways to discover their room. Once within, there's a clear separation between the building and the walls, a layering of privacy and a sliver of landscape for guests to enjoy. Other courtyards are unoccupied pockets of lush garden to offer relief from the sense of enclosure. Constructed entirely from reclaimed gray bricks, the gridded walls' narrow interior passageway forces a long perspective, while light plays off the various brick patterns, enticing guests to venture ever deeper into the project. And you see the context. And this is the reception, and I will show you the reception image. This is where you check in. Many of the furnitures were built locally, and so sectionally a lot of them were a little bit bulkier than our usual way of designing. But by employing local craft we're revitalizing the very notion of rural condition that it was very important for us. Many of these pieces were made here locally. And granting there were a lot of tensions between construction workers because a lot of them don't even read drawings. They would just look at bricks and you have to be there to tell them how to do it. So half of our detailed drawings were literally thrown away. And all they want to see is they want to see perspectives, and it's kind of strange way of doing it, but this is sort of a new paradigm we have to deal with. There's 3 additional buildings outside. There's the warehouse and a new building that we had to deal with. This is entirely new building. So our ambition lies in utilizing a strong landscape element in this particular project, the wall and the courtyard, to unify, as I said, a complex site and program for the rustic materiality and layered spaces, seek to redefine tradition with a modern landscape. We made a conscious effort about 5 years ago to start taking on more rural projects. They're very difficult to deal with because many of them don't really understand what professional services are. Fees are low. Construction techniques are very rougher than even what we are used to. And so it is a challenge for us because it takes a lot of people on site to monitor the progress of the project. But given the condition of the project, she's talking about this a lot, that if we don't, some of the projects, many of the cultural heritage that we're talking about, pretty much disappear. So we have to find this conviction to bring it back live. It's not over like that, but making a point, rebringing consciousness, restoring many of these historic sites that are abandoned, having the government work with them. Great. We should try to see. So by doing this, many of the people that have for instance, bricklayers, farmers, they would go to Shanghai and they would end up being drivers or maids. They really don't like what they do. And yet they're so far away from their family, and they only go back home once a year, and it's highly dysfunctional. But by bringing, I'm not saying that a project will be able to do this, but it's a start. And a group of Chinese architects have started to take the rural area and these rural places more seriously. In fact, you will see in the next 10 years the rise of the rural community. With the present condition and expansion of cities, major metropolitan cities in China, it's unattainable. People are realizing this. started quite through the course of the 3 years they start understanding and start trusting what we're trying to do. It's not trying to control, but actually to understand. And through the process of this understanding, he's a project manager. I gave him the honor to close the door at the end. It took a lot of pain, a lot of hit on this project. So the last project is a project that we recently completed, and I'm gonna try to make it as fast as possible. When we were approached by quite an enlightened Aranya developer, and many of you might have noticed, if I'm looking at this map, it's Qinghuangdao. Qinghuangdao is about an hour flight from Shanghai and 3 hours by train from Beijing. And he picks a lot of these sites, and his idea was the city are really hectic, and you need to go out and buy your second homes, and sort of these are places of reprieve. And it's always interesting if you look at all his development, many of them have big major housing projects, and then there will be cultural destinations. So some of you might know of Vector's architecture, the chapel and the library, and maybe Li Hu's UCCA museum, which is located. So he's quite clever. He would have cultural projects, dotted beautiful cultural projects, and then he would have major housing next to it at the back. So these are places of community, so people are interested, so they come over the weekend, and there will be a library, there would be a chapel, there would be a museum, and so you can, if you're outside the city, there's actually a real community. So I was really excited when he contacted us, when he called me. He says, I have a project in Aranya for you, and I was like, whoa, I must be in one of these beach things, right? Because a lot of my friends and my colleagues from Zhangke to Dongfeng and all these guys have buildings along the beach. Well, I flew there, and he's like, well, yours is not on the beach. Yours is in the center of that red spot. And not only that, I'm building a Spanish Mediterranean project. This was under construction. And that is your space. And this is sort of the Mediterranean Spanish look. So I'm going to sell all these as the Mediterranean dream. And you're going to create this significant cultural place for me, an art center. And it doesn't need to be Spanish. You can do whatever you want to do. And I'm like, okay. So I don't have the water. I don't have the sky. I'm supposed to be in this leisure development, and I don't have both of them. So I said to my team, I started sketching. I said, I'm going to be greedy. I'm going to take the whole site. I have this architect, my associate director did is very sensitive. I said, no time for sensitivity here, because you're trying to be sensitive, and then there's all this Mediterranean town around you. We're going to occupy the whole site, and we're going to create our own sky, and we're going to create our own water. And so I have a big hall, and in this hall you look up and you look down, you look up to the sky and you look down to the water. And so the art center will walk around this. Some people call this, you know, a mini version of Guggenheim. Actually, I didn't think of it, but now that it's complete, I realized that perhaps Frank Lloyd Wright was not all that bad. So here was very simple. It was to create a brief for a fake Mediterranean town in, you know, Qinghuangdao. Despite the straightforward brief on an art center, Aranya as a community has a strong emphasis on the spiritual nature of their lifestyle ideology, a oneness with nature in the environment. Very expensive houses, so the design scheme is as much about the internal courtyard a communal space for the residents as it is about the exhibition being displayed in the center. So here with aggregate concrete, cast in place concrete, what we did was it's all modular. Some of them cast down below and modular, and we brought this system and with bronze framing to highlight the openings. I'm just showing you quickly because I have a long movie. I think 5 minutes, so I think that explains a bit more. So you open to the sky. In here, what happened is very much inspired by Legoretta and his first hotel he did in 1965, before I was born. The water, this is filled with water, and it's kind of flowing, and so if there's an event, the water would be drained and becomes amphitheater. So you see sort of my desire for the beach. I don't have it, so I create my own beach. And the client, after it opened, he said, if I know what I know now, I would not have allowed you to do this, but now that you did it, I actually really like it. I said, sometimes you gotta listen to the architect. So here, these are some of the images, and you see, I'm gonna just go straight to the movie. Did it disappear? Sorry, guys. That's not good. That's not a good way to end. Give me a second. Okay, hold on. Not so fast. Okay. Is there a technical person here who can help me? I am trying to show this movie directly, not from my presentation. How do I view this? How do I view this movie to the screen? Oh. Yeah. Yeah. And how do I, oh, I see, where's my hand? Oh, perfect, perfect. Sorry about that tap, guys. This is the last 5 minutes, I promise. Thank you.
Maybe there's a question or two, if you will.
Yes. No problem. Just
Does
go
the Chinese government ever have a direct influence on your designs? Like they approve or not approve something and then
Whoa,
change a building?
I was about to tell you not to ask political questions, but
I am so sorry.
no, I would love to answer that. Interesting you should ask that question because I think Xi Jinping once said that there needs to be, we have to stop doing ugly buildings. And some people have said that it was directly referencing to Ramkula's CCTV building. I don't think it is, or I'd like to think it is not, because it's one of, actually, I really like that project. We're too small for them to actually care. And our projects are actually too small. So sometimes I wish they do, because if they do, that means they're really paying attention to us. Our project is really small. If it was larger in a bigger urban scale, let's say an airport, for instance, or the main theater, and even that, I don't think they would really be as, they would care as much. And I think they're not as, I think buildings that really does not speak badly of the government, I don't think it's gonna, I think the chapel, I think at one point I was really concerned because there were churches that, churches are technically not allowed, but the developer basically applied it as a place of solitude. Chapel not so much as a place of, and not a specific religion, but a place to worship and gather. So. Abigail, I know you're going to ask that NBA question. I just know it. I could feel it.
Yeah, I'm curious about that, just to follow up in that regard, relative to this question of if they're too small for them to care. Is that intentional, or is that just
I think the Planning Bureau, if you call that a government, part of the government sector, they do care. For instance, they are really, in fact, they are very supportive of what we're doing in terms of preserving the older part and giving them a new way of looking at preservation, for instance. So it does look good for the government. So now, for instance, all the lane houses there are now plaques, so you can't demolish them. That was not the case 15 years ago when we were there. And both Rosanna and I are quite loud in the media about preservation. But obviously, we also are equally loud in not just preserving for the sake of what Svetlana Boym coined as restorative nostalgia, because that would just be another Disneyland. And China has a lot of those fake Disney and fake Mediterranean, and that's the last thing we want. And so trying to understand the essence of the typology that they have, that they're inheriting from courtyard houses to lane houses to those round Tulo houses, and actually where my grandparents are from, they are important. And I think they understand the importance of it. So is there a direct relationship? We must be doing something right for them to actually be very supportive of what we're doing. So
does that relate to the commitment to, I guess, the sense of your commitment to maybe who in those rural communities versus what in those rural communities?
Correct. I think also the issue on revitalizing the rural area is also something that the government is interested in. The president right now is interested in the idea of it can't just be, you can't just support the main cities, but you have to go inward. For instance, going into the Middle West, Chengdu, for instance, Chongqing, all the area I call like Xi'an, all those places are are actually flourishing right now, because it's important. That Silk Road is imperative in his vision to sort of unite the whole nation and revitalize the nation. So it's not just the coastal cities that are being benefit from the economic growth of the country. And in the process, it's helping a lot of the rural villages.
We'll give you the last question.
Thank you so much. That was so wonderful. And I was going to ask you about the NBA, but I think we'll leave it for another day.
Yes.
Thanks again.
Yes. I did watch the LA Lakers and Brooklyn Nets when they play in Shanghai. Right.